Welcome. I'm Faye Waterman, the Conversation Curator, and this is What's Your Superpower? And today my guest is Hayley Wheeler, and Hayley is emotion, mind, performance coach. Welcome, Hayley, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for the invitation to join you, Faye. I'm really excited.
Good. Now, Hayley, we get to talk about you and what your superpowers are. So let's share a little bit about where you come from.
So I am based in the UK, as you can hear with the accent. I have 4 children, and my life was turned upside down through depression in 2015. But it had been going on for about 5 years, and 2015 really was my rock bottom. But it absolutely transformed my life and has created a version of me I didn't know existed.
When you were in that deep, dark stage of depression, do you know what took you there? What was it, the catalyst?
I understand it now. I didn't at the time. I didn't understand what was going on for me at the time. I just remember sort of just over the years, life just got more and more difficult. My head became a really toxic space. So it wasn't really one thing. It was a accumulation of a lot of things going on in my life that I wasn't coping with very well, that I wasn't dealing with in a way that was productive. And I just felt like my life was out of control. And when it got to that really dark and deep part, it was the realization that I was struggling and had to sort of admit it to myself, because I didn't do that. I was trying to just keep going. I was just trying to live through my days and get from morning to night. And that fight takes you away from focusing on why you're feeling like that and what you can do about it.
You have 4 children and you would have had 4 younger children at the time. How are you coping dealing with yourself, but also dealing with children and getting them off to school and doing all the things that you have to do when you have children, and particularly when you've got 4, not 1 or 2?
Yeah, it was, for me, they were my focus. So they were the things that got me out of bed in the morning. I had to get out of bed. I wanted to stay in bed. I wanted to put the quilt over my head. But because I had to get them up, get them dressed, get them fed, get them to school, I kept going, but it became automatic pilot. I just went on default mode. I wasn't sleeping very much. I was sleeping about 2 to 4 hours a night at that point. So I would get up in the morning at 4 or 5 o'clock, depending on when I'd gone to sleep. I'd get up, I would get myself sorted. So I would shower and do all the things that people assume you don't do when you have depression. They assume that you don't get dressed, you don't shower, you don't look after yourself. But I did all of that in the morning. Then I would get the children up, I would get them fed, get them dressed, get them ready for school, get them to school. And then I would sit in self-punishment, and I just didn't understand why I was feeling the way that I felt. And that kind of was my day, unless I was working, and I would go to work and I was competent at work, I was competent as a parent, but I wasn't the best version of myself doing all of those things. So as much as I did everything, I met all their needs. They went to sports, they did their hobbies, they attended school all the time. I was competent, but I was not the best version of myself.
So when you said if you had to go to work, you would go to work and you were competent. If you didn't have to go to work and you took your children to school, and then what would you do? Would you go home and sit or go back to bed? What would you do?
I would try and be productive. I wasn't a sleeper, so I wouldn't go back to bed. I would try and work on my business and do the things that you should be doing, through business, and keep that kind of afloat. But again, it was just doing something for doing its sake. But my head, what was going on in my head in terms of the self-punishment, the self-judgment, the self-criticism, it was so harsh. But I attached meaning to things that would allow me to make excuses for not sort of jumping on a call or not networking. So I was just existing as much as I possibly could without sort of going back to bed.
So you were kind of self-sabotaging in a way that helped you survive in one way, but not in the other, because there was some avoidance there. When you were saying that what was going on in your head, there was, wasn't good, I said that you were self-sabotaging. What sort of things, what sort of stories were going on inside you at that time?
I was feeling like an absolute failure. So I had convinced myself I was failing as a mum and that I was no good for them. I was failing as a daughter, as a wife, that I just wasn't capable of doing anything. I'd convinced myself and was continuously convincing myself that I should just leave everything go and just not do anything. I was a rubbish person and nobody liked me, and I was a rubbish business owner. All these things just kept repeating. But the one thing that probably confused me the most was attaching becoming successful in my business with one of my children dying. So it stopped me from becoming really productive in my business, because if I became successful, then maybe the kind of counter to that would be that one of my children would die, and I could never live with that. And that thought of that happening kept me completely stuck.
Why would you get a thought of, if you became successful, one of your children would die? What was the instigator of that?
There isn't an instigator necessarily. It's just the way that depression and anxiety work. It becomes extremely irrational, and you latch on to things that don't make sense, but they become a reality. And that's what it was for me, that if I became successful, I know that I'd had conversations in the past where people had lost family members. I had a friend who'd lost their sister and he was a millionaire. And it, for me, maybe that was how I connected it, but that was a conversation I had many, many years before. But when you are operating in depression, or you're operating in anxiety or overwhelm or burnout, your brain really doesn't work rationally. It's not about rational thinking. You can sometimes control it and bring it back to rationality, but generally it goes off on its own. And this is where it becomes really difficult to reach out and tell people, because you're already confused yourself. You have all these thoughts going through your mind that you can't make sense of yourself. And if you tell somebody else, then that just reinforces that there's something wrong with you, because nobody thinks like that. So people don't think like that, but you still have those thoughts.
And you were hiding it the best that you could. Did anyone close to you know or understand what you were going through?
Nobody. I put a smile on my face and that was enough. People don't really want to know further than, "You okay?" And we all say, "Yes, I'm fine." The children, I would say, were probably the ones that felt the effects more. However, upon reflection with them in conversations I've had since, they say they still had all these wonderful memories, because I kept going to the park with them. I kept taking them to the beach. I kept all the activities I did before, and I still do now. I kept doing them. But for me, I was never emotionally or mentally or even sometimes spiritually there with them. I was just physically there.
You were physically present but emotionally detached.
And that was probably one of the hardest things to reconciliate in my mind, to sort of, I wanted to be there. They are my children, they're my world. I just had no connection to anything at all.
It's really scary when you get to a stage like that, but you don't realize, or you don't know how to deal with it, how to work through the processes or anything like that. What was the catalyst for you to actually turn that around and get help?
I had a really dark and devastating thought one morning about one of my children. And at that point, my two options were walk away from my children and my family, or do something about it. Up to that point, I had convinced myself there was no way out. This was life forever. But then I realized that I had to. You know, it's either walk away from my children or fight.
Hayley, you were in this dark stage and you were desperate in a way, but you didn't know how to get out of it. And the catalyst, you said, was your children. You needed to do something so that you didn't feel the need to go and leave your children. And that was one thing that you didn't want to do at all. So what made you change? How did you get help? What was it that happened?
At the same time as I was really struggling, my son, I realised at the time, which I didn't know before, had been born with anxiety, and he was 11 at the time. And his behaviour kind of all fell into place. I started to understand why he behaved the way that he behaved. And he became my motivator. So after that dark and devastating thought, it was time to change things. And I helped him overcome his anxiety. So at the time, he was having 8 or 9 panic attacks a day. And I knew that I needed to help him, because if he found drugs at some point, he was going to love drugs, because they would have just taken everything away from him. So I went through this journey of trying to understand what anxiety was like for him and how he lived and what he understood it to be, what his body was like, a really in-depth process with a 11-year-old boy, bless him, and the other children came along for the ride. But I remember trying to explain anxiety to him, and it took me a little while to get him to be able to understand it. And I used a Disney character, Vanellope von Schweetz, who is a little glitch in a game, and I used her as a description for how his system was glitching. So every time he went into fear or anxiety, his body glitched and it didn't stop. So once he understood that, he became open to the help and the support. So I helped him understand his anxiety. I helped him be able to communicate to me what was going on for him, so that I could help him. And then I devised then sort of the foundations of Emotion Mind Dynamic, which is my program. So it was a sheep incident that helped him overcome his anxiety. It was a chance meeting with a sheep. But that day changed his life forever. Being able to understand what happened with this sheep internally allowed him then to start changing what he was doing when he became anxious. So when he went to school, the secondary school, in September of 2016, he had his last anxiety attack on the schoolyard, and that was 7 years ago, but just over 7 years ago. And then it was my turn, because seeing that what I could do for him with how I worked with him, I knew I could do it for myself. So once he was straight and he was no longer feeling anxious and struggling with things, I just turned all the same kind of principles on myself, and I learned about who I am. I learned about what depression is like, and I really dug deep in a way that society really doesn't allow us to dig deep. And that was what changed my life.
The power of the mind, it can be dangerous, but it can be a brilliant thing, can't it? Did you go and get help, or did you just research and help your son and watched him change the way he processed things? And when he was feeling anxious or going to have an anxiety attack, he now, through you helping him, can control that and do things to prevent him from feeling that situation? Or do you need to allow yourself to sit in that anxiety or understand what the triggers are so it doesn't happen? Does that any make sense?
For everybody, it's really about understanding what your internal patterns are, and that was what it was for him. So once he understood, so this sheep was allowed him to reflect upon what happened for him. He'd become so aware of his internal pattern with the work that we were doing, that when this sheep incident happened, about 5 minutes after it happened, he was able to tell me exactly what was going on in his head, in his mind, in his body, in his emotions. And that's the key. That self-knowledge for me is that superpower. Really understanding who you are is tremendous in terms of being able to make decisions. So once he'd understood that, and he'd had that last anxiety attack, he doesn't have to manage anxiety. There are times when he worries a bit more, but he has to just learn, again, go back to that internal pattern. What is going on for me? How am I understanding this situation? And that's changed his life. He's a completely different, well, 19-year-old now. Everybody needs to that knowledge of how they operate in given situations. So whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, whether it's sports, whether it's leadership, whether it's relationships, when you understand how you operate from the inside out, you connect better with yourself and you connect better with the outside world.
Absolutely. And allowing yourself to be you and to communicate is one of the most powerful things that you can do. Communicating with yourself and having that understanding, but also communicating and feeling comfortable communicating to someone who you trust, that you can share that feeling with, which takes away the fear, takes away that anxiety.
I think one of the key things that people don't understand about emotions, we're in society, we're very much about hiding emotions and not communicating them, not sharing them, not having to deal with other people's emotions. But the key to actually not controlling depression or anxiety but it's actually getting to the emotional root of it, is emotional processing, expressing, and releasing. Now, this is something that even in counselling and therapy isn't done. And I think this is what, again, is a superpower when you learn that skill.
I think what you're saying there is that you get to the root cause. And once you deal with the root cause, everything works out the way it needs to work out. But in therapy, really, and I've seen it many, many times, is that they don't deal with the root cause. They just deal with the issues at hand and suppress them with medication. So what you do is you actually delve deep when you're working with a client. You delve deep in to find that root cause, and then you work through the processes to bring them out of that. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, that sounds about right. My whole process is about holistic development, so developing the person as a whole. So we look at things like beliefs, values, we look at self-esteem issues, we look at relationship issues, because we are not just the emotion. The emotion is the key thing. So that is kind of your foundation, because what we do is when we go through life, we go through all these different experiences, and instead of sharing the emotions, we collect the emotional impact and we keep it inside. So we push it into our emotional vessel, and once that gets full, this is when anxiety and depression are at their worst, because we have no more capacity. It takes over our mind, which is what I was saying earlier about my mind being confused and irrational and not within my control. And it takes over your emotional impulses, it takes over your reactions, and we live with our emotional vessel being full. And this is why we live with such high anxiety and such high depression. But once you start to process and express those emotions that are caught up in your emotional vessel, it gives you space to breathe, it gives you space to think, it gives you space to cope with life as you used to cope with it. And this is all down to society saying we don't want to deal with other people's emotions. So we need to learn that skill socially, we need to learn that skill community, we need to learn that skill across the world.
And it is a skill that needs to be learned. And I think everyone needs to have an understanding of it and a respect for it, because there are so many mental health issues in the world now, particularly after what's happened over the last few years. I think that dealing with the root causes and the emotions, because when we're high in emotion, we're low in intelligence. And not saying that we're not intelligent, but our emotions have taken over and we can't think the way we normally do if we're in that heightened emotional state.
Yeah, and people are living with this for a long time. This is not just something that, by the time people come to me to work with me, this is not something that happened last week. And this is where I think you talked about counselling and therapy being that surface level. We go to them to deal with the crisis to hand. I work with people, let's understand what the crisis at hand is, but let's look at where it's come from. Let's look at the history that brings you to that point so that you're able to process, express, and release things. Because when you just deal with the surface level things, and this happens a lot with self-care as well, we deal with the surface level. Well, I'm feeling stressed, I'm going to go for a run. Okay, that's great. But if you have to go for a run 4, 5, 6, 7 times a week in order to deal with stress every week, then there's a long-term issue there. That's not a crisis at hand. That's a long-term issue. So it's being able to really face those emotional challenges. And actually, I don't understand why we're so afraid of emotions. I used to be afraid of emotions. I thought I saw them as a weakness. But now I don't understand, because of the work that I've done, why individuals and societally we are afraid of emotions.
I don't know what to say there. I think that the emotional side of things, if we show that, or if we've been brought up in a space, in a family or an environment where emotions are never shown, it's a weakness and it's something that is learned. So therefore, as an adult, it's there until we deal with, as you say, deal with the root cause, deal with the issue at hand, but then delve back into where it actually comes from. And it can come from even before you're born. And then when you're born and things happen, it's just an accumulation of so much over a long period of time. So you take people back on a journey, take them back to something that has triggered them, and you have the processes to work through those things and bring them back to where they are today, so that then they are able to show their emotions, be vulnerable, show their strengths, because vulnerability is a strength, really. We've always looked at it as a weakness, but it's not a weakness.
And I think this is the messaging we're getting through society, is that if you show emotions, it's weak. They are a soft skill, but as you said earlier, they are so impactful. And it's when you harness those emotions, once you've emptied that emotional vessel, it gives you the ability to, as you rightly say, be vulnerable in a way that doesn't make you feel weak, because we equate vulnerability with weakness. But actually, when you harness emotions to the point where you understand them yourself, you can communicate them, you can feel them without falling apart, that, yes, you will still be a little bit vulnerable, but there's a strength in being able to say, do you know what, I am really sad today. I'm just sad. But we as a society go, well, I don't want to hear that you're sad. I don't want to deal with that because I don't know what to do with it, because that's the messaging you get through society from birth. So we need to change that messaging.
Yeah, and it is a message, isn't it? And there's nothing wrong with sitting in some sadness. There might be something that's happened that makes you feel sad. You should allow yourself to sit in that sadness for a period of time, but not always, not continue that sadness. It's something that you can sit in for an hour or 2 hours, but take yourself out of that, because you can find yourself getting bogged down with this sadness and not being able to concentrate on other things. So, Hayley, when you are working with someone, if you can give an example of, don't have to mention names, but give an example of a client that you've worked with and the type of emotional issue that they've had, and how you've worked through that process with them, and the result that you've gotten from that.
So this particular client came to me at a point where his relationship was kind of, he felt that it was coming to an end. He wasn't connected with his children at all. He was self-medicating through alcohol and drugs. He was upset all the time, but obviously, you know, the messaging is men don't cry. So he was holding all that together. The emotions were manifesting in a way that sometimes was aggressive to other people. He'd been in prison because of the aggression. he was just falling apart when he came to see me. And I remember the first time he came, he'd kind of been encouraged by his wife to just come and speak to me. And he cried. The first session was all about the tears. He just let everything out. And he says now that the thing that made me or made him like me and want to work with me is that I am open and honest about my journey, and there was no judgment. He could tell me whatever he wanted to tell me, and there's absolutely no judgment at all. So the process is from that one session, we have an initial meeting, then it's 6 sessions. And through the 6 sessions, I took this gentleman through his behavior analysis. So we look at the ways that he's coping with all the emotions he's feeling. Now we're talking about a lot of really powerful emotions, things like anger, frustration, disappointment, shame, guilt, these huge emotions that they gather momentum through life as well, because you continuously do things that make you feel that way. So you're on this roller coaster. So they were very much emotions. Well, he's never dealt with any emotions, but they were very much emotions he's never dealt with, apart from allowing them to come out in unhealthy ways. So we looked at the behavior analysis, which allows him to understand how he's coping, and it kind of allows him to give himself some space and permission to just be in that moment at the time. Just let yourself be like that for now. Then in the same session, we do the coaching model, which allows them to understand their internal patterns, which he did. Then we dive into the really deep stuff, which is we start the emotional process and expressing, releasing. So we start looking at beliefs, and we start looking at the life reflections from the emotional impact perspective. So as much as he could tell me what he'd been through in his life, which was really horrendous from birth, he hadn't had a good life, he was able to start communicating what the emotional impact of those things. And that's the thing we don't do. We really don't focus on the emotional impact. We focus on what we've been through. So we went through that, and then we have a 4-hour session. So session 2 is me taking them through my life reflections and kind of showing that I'm vulnerable too, and they connect with that. Session 3 is them taking me through their life reflections. Then we look at the relationship evaluation, which generally is their relationship with themselves. We look at how they have treated themselves throughout their life. So he was able to understand all the self-punishment, the self-sabotage, all those things that he'd done. He was able to kind of put them into context instead of blaming himself. He was able to understand that all these things he's been through have made him feel this way, which kind of influences how he behaves. Then we do a really in-depth letter that this really is your processing, expressing and releasing. This is getting really honest with yourself about the emotions. And then the final session is about understanding your values and laying that base for moving forward and having a healthy lifestyle. So for him, he was able to reconnect with his wife. He really re-engaged with his children and became the parent that he wanted to be. He made mistakes, of course he did. He got a promotion in work. He was no longer self-medicating. Obviously, this drink happens every so often. What he's learning and still learning today is that drink isn't a good outlet for him. But we all do have that drink every so often. And when that happens, he has to manage the consequences of that, but he's aware of that. Then he went on to, he changed jobs and he got a job with a different company, which he wouldn't have done before. And he went on to win medals in martial arts as well. So this guy went from being literally just existing in a world where he felt that he had to defend himself constantly to being engaged and living a life that he wants to live. And, I'm in contact with him every so often, and there's still challenges because it was a lifetime of things that happened, but he's able to process those things. Sometimes he needs a little reminder of just do this, just remember this skill.
Yeah.
And he processes things again, and it's just an amazing process to watch.
But when you've got a lifetime of self-sabotage and punishing yourself, and you don't really understand it until he meets someone such as yourself who creates the awareness for him and the understanding of what's going on, and then gives him the processes to be able to work through it all, it makes a difference, a whole difference in people's lives. And to see the results of someone coming to you who's in this deep, dark hole and then leaving with the possibilities and the hope of a better life and an understanding that they can do anything, anything's possible because they're aware.
Yeah, that's just amazing. I find it's a privilege when people choose to work with me. It's a privilege for me to, because it's such an intense, emotionally in-depth process, that for someone to choose me to do that with just makes me feel, I don't know, I suppose special in a way. Because
these are the sorts of things, and I think you feeling honoured or special or privileged to work with these people, I think what it is that you actually draw them to you because you have developed that trust so that people can come to you. And that's what it's all about. If they can trust you, they will work with you and they will refer you to others. So it's not just an honor. I think it's that you have the wisdom, the knowledge, the skills, the magic, the brilliance to be able to bring the best out in somebody, to be able to get them to see the issue that they have and work them through that process and take them from that deep, dark hole back out into the world where they want to be and need to be for lots of different reasons, and to start living their life. The work that you do is specialized, but it's desperately needed out in the big wide world.
yeah, absolutely. One of my values is my job to earn your trust. And I say that to my clients all the time. And if I ever put myself in a position where I'm not earning your trust, then tell me. So when they come and work with me, it's my job. It's never their job just to trust me because of my position and what I do. It's always my job to earn that every day. So if it's in communication with them, if it's in a session, and that, because I am so honest and open and vulnerable myself with the process as well, when they go through it, they feel able to do that. And that's a big part of it. It's that connection with somebody on such a deep level. And one of the things I went many years ago, I went to do a talk in a group of people who had been in and out of mental health institutions for most of their lives. And I'm talking about people in their 60s and 70s and 80s at this point. And I asked the question, have we forgotten the person behind the mental health? And it was a resounding yes. That person is no longer there. When you are institutionalized like that, you are no longer a person, you are your mental health condition. So my job is always to treat people like people. So I don't treat them like their mental health, I don't treat them like their depression, I don't treat them, that's not what I do. I just see them as a person who is struggling, and my job then is to separate them from their mental health challenges and develop the person that they are so that they can cope with that challenge that they have. And that for me that's the special process. That's the way of, if I can take you away from being anxiety, because people become anxiety, they become depression, they become burnout. When I separate them and they become a person in their own right who is struggling with something external, that process is amazing to watch, because you literally can see it happening. They are stepping into their power as a human being, not somebody who is riddled with anxiety.
I remember, you just reminded me, when I was teaching exercise class, and I used to go into a mental health hospital and teach class, but also take them for walks. And I always called them repeat offenders, because they'd go in and they'd be there for 2 to 3 weeks, like zombies, and they'd go out into the big wide world. They'd be out there for a while, but their comfort wasn't out in the big wide world. The security was in the institution. And so I called them repeat offenders, and I always said the root cause is never being treated. they just talk about what's happened to them over and over again instead of going into the root cause, dealing with it, working through the process, and allowing them to go out, find themselves, be the person that they maybe once was, and allow that to happen. But it doesn't happen.
No, and see, this is my opinion of that. I think it's a very good business model. I think mental illness is a good business model in terms of, so when you have a challenge and you go and see a therapist, as we said earlier, they look at the crisis at hand, they deal with that crisis, and they set you up to move on to the next part of your life. The problem being that keeps coming back. So you have a boomerang effect where they feel good for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months, but yet they find they need therapy because they haven't learned the skills, they haven't learned the knowledge they needed to learn, and they haven't got to the emotional root. And I think that's the key, is that they keep coming back. So this business model is that boomerang model, where they're on a cycle constantly, where they need some kind of therapy. Whereas my business model is not great, but the results for clients are amazing because they get to live and they get not to need me anymore. And I'm not saying, like I was talking about the client earlier who does come back every so often and say, oh, look, I've done this and this is happening. And it's just a little reminder of, get in touch with the coaching model again, and let's use that again. Or have you thought about this and remember this? And that's fine, but they don't need me. They don't need to come back and see me and have, another round of emotion mind dynamic, because they have learned skills, they have learned the knowledge, they've learned the self-knowledge, and they've learned how to process, express, and release emotions as they happen, not wait until they start to build up again.
Mm. So you've taught them, you've done the work with them so that they can go out, but they have this trust. They have an awareness of what's going on, and they feel like they're falling back into something, and they have this trust to come back to you and say, I just need to have this conversation with you because this and this and this is happening. And then they can go away, but you have got their back regardless of what's going on in their life. And if they need you, they're going to contact you, because what you've done for them is create a world that they've always wanted but never had. So how fantastic is that? And I'd say what you do, you undermined it a little bit before. I would say it's brilliant. I think that's your superpower, to be able to bring people back to a life that they've deserved to have, one where they have the awareness that if something's going or not going right for them, they have the skills or the knowledge to be able to work through the processes that you've taught them. But even greater than that is, if they feel that it is too overwhelming for them, that they can come back to you, have that conversation, and know that they can go away and continue with life.
Yeah, they'll know they'll just get a reminder of the skills that we've learned, because sometimes we forget, and when you fall into, it's very easy to fall into old patterns. And that's the thing. Life is never going to be perfect. It's not about perfection. And I think this is something that people expect, or, my life's going to be perfect from now on. It's really not. You have no control over what's going to happen to you. But what you do have control over is what skills, knowledge, and information and actions you take in order to deal with that and manage it. But my thing is, I don't work with them so that they have to manage things going forward. I work with them so that they're in control to create that life that they want.
Yeah. So what would you say your superpowers are, Hayley?
I have to say self-knowledge is a super. I have to say that's been one of my biggest superpowers, because if I hadn't learned that myself, I wouldn't be doing the job that I'm doing. But I really do think it's just treating human beings like human beings, and not looking. We don't really talk a lot about mental health, believe it or not, even though the program is really about improving their mental health. We don't talk about it a lot, unless it's my anxiety's been this way this week, or I felt better this week on my anxiety. We really don't delve into that. We really do look at what's going on. So I create a space where people feel confident and able to look at the emotional side of life where they cannot do that anywhere else. I create that space where they feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to be open, to be honest, and to do the work that they need to do to develop themselves into the person that they deserve to be.
And to be themselves, to be the real them, and not pretend to be something that they're not, or conforming to others and being untrue to themselves. They begin to develop that truth, that how do you say it? It's something. It's being authentic to themselves and being honest with themselves and saying, well, I don't have to pretend to be that. I don't have to pretend that I like that, or I don't have to pretend. It is my authentic right to be me, and you give them that.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing process.
I think you're needed in the big wide world to work with people, because there are so many people out there struggling. There's so many people out there that need you in their life, and they don't need you in their life forever. They need you in their life just to get through that bumpy road out on the other side, get out of that hole, get up those steps and step out into the real world and be themselves. And they need you to take them through that so that they can do that. Your superpower is to bring them back to a place where they honor themselves.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to look at it. They do. And just when you've lived a life for such a long time where you've believed that there's something wrong with you, to then start to believe that actually it's not that there's something wrong with me, it's just my life experience, and that's what's happened to me, that's been the emotional impact on me. And to be able to go through that process and stand in that honor and that power of self, just awesome.
But you did it yourself. So therefore, you went through the anxiety, the depression, feeling, I don't know, I don't understand it because I've never not experienced it. So, but you brought yourself out the other side. You taught your son who was living with anxiety. I'm not going to say suffer. I say people live with these issues. And you taught him to be aware and to understand what the triggers are, and gave him strategies to work through those things when they were happening, so that the anxiety didn't come to a head and he couldn't deal with it. He could deal with it there and then. And I think that's beautiful. It's more than beautiful. It's, I don't know, words fail me, but I think that the power that you have within you, that superpower, is to give people back their lives in a true way.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Somebody said to me recently, why did you help your son? I said, well, I didn't even opt for, there was no other way to do it. I didn't see another way. I didn't have another option. It was my decision to just, and they brought attention to the fact that you had depression and you were not coping with your life, but you still helped your son. There are not many people who could do that. And I've never thought of it like that. And a lot of people will say to me, I could never do your job. You must be exhausted with it. And I'm not. I get energized by working with people. So being able to, the results for me are what it's all about. That result for the person. It's not about what I do, or yes, I know what part of the process I play, but seeing that person go from existing to living, it's a miracle sometimes to see where they've come from and where they head. So I get to see miracles all the time with people.
You ever
And
do
I
a
can't.
happy dance? I'd be doing a happy dance, because you know, when you see someone come in and sit down and you're working through the processes and there's such a weight on their shoulders, and you watch that lift and lift and lift, and then they walk out of there in their last session, I'd be doing a happy dance.
I do sometimes behind closed doors because I don't want them to see the happy dance. No, I just, yeah, you know, I'm so impressed by the hard work. It is hard work. There's
Mhm.
no doubt it's hard work. This is not an easy process. Otherwise, we'd all be doing it.
Yeah,
But seeing them do that hard work when they're at their lowest, and we must not forget that they come to me at their lowest. They're desperate generally. So to see them do that, yeah, it does deserve a happy dance sometimes. It does deserve, well, it deserves a celebration every time. And
absolutely. I think you should honor yourself. That's not being egotistical or anything. I think that you should honor yourself every time that you see one of your clients walk out of there in a space that gives them their life back, because that's giving you something as well. It's giving you back some of the energy and whatever it is, to be able to work with the next client and work with the next client. And honoring yourself is how it needs to be.
I'm learning that skill because I'm very much used to doing things and getting results with people and celebrating for them, but not, even though I understand that, and they say this to me all the time, I couldn't have done this without you. I understand that because I have the knowledge, the skills, and all that kind of stuff that I give to them. But I never spend the time on anything, whether it's, I achieved my master's in 2019. 2 years later, I then decided that actually that was a good thing. So this is something I am learning to do for myself. And it's taking time.
So honor yourself every time you see someone walk out that door and start their new life, because that is exciting. I want to thank you, Hayley, for sharing your experiences, your superpowers, because you have many. You give people back the life that they haven't had for a long, long time. They respect you for that. So thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, thank you for being here. It's been brilliant. It's been a really enlightening conversation for me because I've kind of had some aha moments as well. So it's been brilliant. Thanks, Faye.
That's what it's meant to be, some aha moments, to recognize you and your brilliance, your magic, those superpowers that you have, Hayley.
Thank you.
I'm Faye Waterman, and this has been What's Your Superpower, the podcast, and I'll be back again sometime soon. Bye for now.